On today's adventure, we're boarding the Titanic Museum in Pigeon Forge, Tennessee to listen to the authors of a book called Sea of Glass. They have spent hours upon hours researching the Titanic and will answer questions such as, will the Titanic be completely gone from the bottom of the ocean in 50 years? Was there a fire on board the Titanic? Could there be photographs out there of the Titanic sinking? And much more. So sit back and relax and enjoy highlights of this panel discussion.
I am LA Beatles. I'm the host of Unsinkable, the Titanic podcast, and I've been really fortunate to work with the museum on a lot of events and projects, and we want to thank them for allowing us to use the space, of course, and for being here. This is wonderful. I want to introduce you to our panel, and then I want them to have a chance to talk to you. This is Bill Wormstead. This is J. Kent Layton, Tad Fitch, and Stephen Schweikert, and they're our author historian panel today. Copy of Isabella's book on a Sea of Glass, which I have referred to as the Titanic Bible. I don't know, how weird that may sound to some, but I believe in many ways it truly is. So I obviously want to open this up to questions from everybody, but I'm going to start with a couple of thematic questions because I think the theme of the panel too is untold stories. A lot of what these guys have done in this book, which I highly recommend, is kind of break down the mythologies of Titanic, the standard stories that you think you know, but let's unfurl them by going down in some areas almost a minute by minute, play by play of what we know happened the night of the sinking, just impeccably researched, and it's incredible. So I wanted to start by throwing a pretty arguably vague question at you, but I want to see kind of where you take it. I think, for me, one of the biggest Titanic mythologies that obsesses me is Thomas Andrews, right, for example. Because of the mythology, we think of him standing in front of the fireplace at the end. In the film, he's there. He's got a little tumbler full of whiskey that's slowly coming off of the mantle. And it's this very romantic notion that he was there to the last and sort of contemplating the death of his ship. But there's a lot more to the story. He's seen in a lot of other places in the ship. Doesn't necessarily back up that mythology. So because it's one that sort of obsesses me, I wanted to kind of throw that out as an intro question. It's something that your book takes a look at. So what's the untold story on that, and what's actually going on with Andrews?
Yeah, that is a very compelling story. Everyone knows Thomas Andrews.
Every movie has had Thomas Andrews standing in the smoking room looking up at the picture.
And not just the Cameron movie from '97, everyone. If you go back to A Night to Remember, if you go back to West Titanic, he's always in the smoking room at the end. And that's the way the books have portrayed it. That's all you ever hear. When we were doing On a Sea of Glass, our decision was we don't take anything for granted. We don't just regurgitate something that was in another book and accept it as fact. We actually do the homework. We go back and look at the survivor statements. And I remember there was this one thread that we caught. It was in another book. It was a first-hand account that was quoted. And it was from a young mess steward who had traveled back to Europe on the Lapland with someone who knew Thomas Andrews. David Galloway, I believe his name was.
Yes.
Yeah. And Galloway was, not only he knew Andrews, but he also knew Lord Peary, who was Andrews' uncle. And so Galloway was talking to a lot of different people on the Lapland, surviving crew members and whatnot, because a lot of them were traveling on that one trip. And he was trying to find out what had happened to Andrews at the end. And he wrote a letter back to Lord Peary with some of his findings, and one of the findings was that a young mess steward had told him that he had seen Andrews and Captain Smith go overboard from the side of the bridge at the last minute. This made kind of the hair on the back of my neck stand up when I read that, because Tad had already done a lot of legwork on Captain Smith's fate. And one of the things that he had determined in his work was Captain Smith was very likely going over from the side of the bridge at the end. So suddenly you have this sighting that's like, wait a minute, that makes sense, that would fit. Now we wanted to know, where did the smoking room story come from? And we ran that back through, and that went all the way back to, what was that? Was that
1912, actually.
Sean Bullock's book, Thomas Andrews Shipbuilder.
Yeah.
Yeah. And one of the things with that, my voice is going, so hopefully you guys can understand me. But as Bill said, it's Shane Bullock. His book about Thomas Andrews in 1912 was a biography, and there's a lot of really good information. He had a habit when he wrote that book of quoting witnesses, but not naming who they are. So you have to do a little detective work to figure it out. Like, he has some really good quotes from stewardess Annie Robinson, but he doesn't mention her name. So you have to go back to the Titanic inquiries, and there's a lot of overlap in the statements and say, oh, that's clearly who that witness was. It's been assumed for years, Shane Bullock, that because he mentioned a steward seeing Thomas Andrews in the smoking room, he doesn't even claim, this is the interesting thing we found, he didn't even claim that it was the last sighting of Andrews in 1912. He mentioned several examples in the book of him being seen after that on deck, throwing deck chairs overboard. And in one instance, he actually talks about an unnamed witness that saw him carrying a life belt towards the bridge. So even back in 1912, this account didn't say that that was the last place he was seen. We did a little more digging, and the witness that a lot of people think was this individual was the steward named Jack Stewart. But he's not mentioned in Bullock's book, and we can't find any reason why people thought it was Stewart, other than the fact that there was some confusion about how he was saved from the ship. Do you want to talk about that part?
In the inquiries, I forget whether it was the British or the American, one of the survivors said, the steward, young Stewart. And we were discussing, is that a mistranscription? And it was really just young Stewart. And anyway, we tracked it back to this. We can show that Jack Stewart, the steward, got off in lifeboat 15, which left the ship about 1:40 at night. And that's long before the ship sank. So we kept digging, and in Sean Bullock's book, it talks about the mess steward that they mentioned, Cecil Fitzpatrick, says that he was looking around at the very end, as the ship is going under, looking around to get off, and he went through the bridge and he saw Andrews and Smith standing there talking, and he heard Smith say, "She's going." And Fitzpatrick kind of leaned up against the sideboard, kind of conked out for a minute. And then he came to. He went out the starboard side of the bridge and started helping the people get collapsible A off. Fitzpatrick ended up in the water, and later on in the evening, lifeboat 12 picked him up. One of the passengers in 12, do you remember who it was, Ted? One of the women.
Yeah, there's correct collaboration for us.
There's collaboration that Fitzpatrick was in the water, he was picked up by 12. So everything we've seen indicates he was on the bridge at the very end. And he said Smith and Andrews went off the bridge into the water, which kind of agreed to a certain extent with Brie, who also said he saw Captain Smith going into the water.
Specifically off the port side.
Yeah, so the pieces fit. We're convinced that Andrews and Smith went off the bridge at the end.
And that's not, I mean, I suppose in many ways that's more compelling and sort of, devastating but beautiful a thing to imagine than even Andrew's end, in the smoking room, in front of the painting.
Because Irsmay is in collapsible sea, it gets a lot of attention. Is he kind of pushing, oh, get away, woman who wants to board, this lifeboat. When he says at the end, I looked around, there were no women, there were no children, there was no one else to get in, and then I got in. He's been painted as being a coward for, over a century. But if the boat's not full, then if there are women and children around, where are they and why aren't they in the boat? It's just one of those questions that you kind of have to wrestle with. So, we were lucky because we got to deal with that we were very thankful that Irsmay was in that boat, because his being in the boat with the four of them shed a little bit more light on their story and vice versa. And to us, it also gave a little bit more information about Irsmay and his situation, because, you know, on the one hand, he doesn't want to be painted, you know, I'm speaking in 1912 terms, okay? He doesn't want to be a gentleman painted with the same brush as, you know, as he put it, the Chinamen or Filipinos that were hiding underneath the seats, because he survives in the same boat. So how's he going to explain being there when they're there at the same time? So he's walking it's a very interesting to read his testimony and see how he navigates that. But I think the evidence kind of leans in his direction.
This actually segued into something I was thinking, so.
Oh, great, awesome.
But I really think it's critical. You look at everybody that was aboard Titanic, that it wasn't a uniform racial, ethnic, financial, economic status. Everybody was affected by that, and obviously third-class passengers were disproportionately victims compared to first class and second class. So it's really important as a historian that we're not looking at it through a monochrome lens. We want to tell the story of everybody that was aboard, not just one small segment of all those people. But you asked for an example, and one of the things I was thinking when you were talking about the Asian passengers was that most of the third class did come up very late. We had an interesting example of, in 1912, there's a lot of these stories were told in the press, but in lesser known papers, and maybe things that the readers of that paper at the time saw, and then it kind of fell off and it was in an archive and nobody's ever looked at it again. There was an example of a third class passenger of Middle Eastern descent. His anglicized version of his name is Philip Zenny. That's how he spelled it in the papers, but it obviously wasn't spelled that way when he wrote it himself. But he got up on deck extremely early compared to any other steerage passenger. In fact, we think he might have been the first one in a lifeboat, period.
Possible.
Yeah, possible. And what is interesting, he was on the forward port side, and the big difference in a lot of ways was the port side. Many of you have heard this and know this, that Mike Toller and Chief Officer Wild and the officers that were overseeing things on the port side allowed women and children only and didn't allow men in most cases, where on the starboard side, Murdoch was much more judicious about letting men in after women and children. But Zenny somehow got on deck very early, and he tried to get into lifeboat number 8, which by all the best evidence appears to be the first lifeboat that was lowered on the port side. He tried to get into that boat several times and was basically tossed out by the officers, allegedly by gunpoint, and we have some other accounts of that. And it's actually witnessed by somebody that was in lifeboat number 6, which Margaret Brown was in, which is why that's a famous boat. But he got thrown out, and then he ends up going to lifeboat 6, and he's waiting around there, and right before it lowers, he manages to basically, and he admits this, he dives, he sneaks in behind the officer's back and got away, like quite significant amount of time earlier than any other steerage passenger. So this is an anecdote that was in the paper that had largely been ignored for years and years, but he told his story very detailed. So I think one of the things that I would recommend for telling those lesser known stories is that you don't go back to the same source material, the same books, the same everything else. If you wanted to represent everybody, you have to go back and try to hear the voice of all those different people and not just focus on what's already been told.
The one thing I wanted to mention is some of this research takes years of digging. Tad and I were involved on a project a couple years ago to try to figure out who was in what lifeboat. We worked on it for 4 years. When we finished up, we had a large number of people. We know exactly what lifeboat they got off in. Some people we think, well, they were here or they were there. And there's about 80 people we have no accounts for. We know they lived, but we have no idea which lifeboat they got off on. We can't tell. And that's after 4 years of digging. And Tad and I were part of a team of known Titanic researchers, people who had been digging into this for years. George Behe, Don Lynch, what else did we have, Tad? Craig Stringer.
Yeah, Craig.
Yeah, there were 10 of us in there digging. And even after 4 years, we could not figure it all out. We worked on a sea glass for 1.5 years. And now we're working on trying to create a brand new edition of it, which is going to have some Would you say significant differences? You want to talk about that?
So the thing of it is when you're a historian, you never want to get locked into your understanding as it was in 2012, 2011. Your research is constantly moving forward. And as you learn more, you have to be willing to take a step back and eat humble pie sometimes when the evidence suddenly comes to light that you were wrong, and say, okay, so now we have more information, that means we have to revise this, we have to revise that. And that's the most important thing to do, so that you can, because the story is constantly evolving as you learn more. So you really have to be willing to allow your conclusions to be shaped as new information is coming to light. And it can take a lot of work, because you also don't want to jump the gun and say, oh, here's one account that completely changes everything, or just look at it from one perspective and say, well, this changes everything. You have to have, I think the term that we kind of coined when we did the interview back in October was a holistic approach to research. You have to allow different perspectives. It's not just about the list or the trim of the ship, it's about people flow. What were the officers in charge doing? Is your finding going to mean that Murdoch basically had to take a nap for a half an hour because of your new findings that you're going to put out there? That doesn't work with what we know about Murdoch's efforts in launching and filling the boats. So it's a very involved, very complicated process, and it takes a lot of balance. And that's why I like working with Tad and Bill, because whereas one of us might tend to have one viewpoint, the other one or two will give perspective. And we kind of fill in the blanks, and it allows us to kind of balance each other out as we move forward. And so the 4th edition text is not finalized yet, but we have identified a number of things that are going to need some refinement. And some of them made it into Recreating Titanic for 22 when we released that. There are more that we've already incorporated in this year's live stream video that we're going to be doing tomorrow night. So you're going to get a sneak peek at some of the updates and refinements and what you might expect. But it is going to take a while, because once we finish the text, then we have to take it to the publisher. And who knows how long that process will take. And in the meantime, that's why we're continuing to recommend the 3rd edition, because it contains the most up-to-date of what's available. And we're trying to full steam ahead on the research, for sure.
I would imagine it's the moment the 2nd edition goes to bed, probably 5 minutes later, it's time to work on the 3rd, right? Because it's
pretty much. This is the 3rd edition here that's out right now. We have found out that the Kindle edition is 2nd edition.
Oh, okay. So if you have it on Kindle,
you're reading a 2nd edition. I think 2nd edition was 2013. That edition is 2015. What year will be on the upcoming 4th edition? I don't know. We can't tell. And we have to finish our work, then we give it to the publisher. They have to make some decisions. We know people would love a hardback, and we'll tell them that, but that's their decision. It's out of our hands. Once we turn it back to the publisher, it's out of our hands, and we're stuck with whatever they choose to do.
Well, we've been talking a lot about this over the course of this weekend just at the museum, and it's the museum does a really good job of that, constantly updating, almost sometimes in real time, and prioritizing updates as new research comes to light, and it's why, what you guys do here is so wonderful. The writing process is arduous. Stephen, for example, I didn't even tell you I was going to ask you this question, so if there's not an answer, no pressure. But in terms of, there's a Chinese version of the 6 that has been published. And this will be the US edition, which you said is going to be quite different. But you did the primary research on the Chinese passengers, and the bulk of that was 2017, 18.
Yeah.
So, for example, has anything changed between then and now? Like, in the writing and research process for the new book, do you find that you're already having to update yourself?
Certainly. So, first of all, because there is an existing documentary version of, it's not the companion book to the documentary. Arthur made his film, which is primarily about the researchers and how we discovered the story. That's what he likes to do as a director. He likes to document the process. Whereas I very specifically, if we had not found any descendants or if we were not able to advance the story significantly in any way, I would have viewed it as complete failure, and I'm not sure that I would have written a book. Whereas Arthur would have been very happy with that as long as I threw the phone across the room, and he managed to get it on camera. It's sort of a different goal. But first of all, because he's limited to 100 screen minutes to tell the story of 6 passengers or try to round off the life stories of 6 passengers, he was pretty confined into what he could say. Plus, he's stuck with whatever we find or don't find. One of the stories that we kind of round off early in the documentary just kind of petered out. Just too many names, too many similar names, not enough evidence, and just kind of, that was it. That was all we could do with that one in particular. With the book, I have to, it gives me a chance to talk a lot more about, okay, I think this passenger went up this staircase and ended up in this boat, and here's why it's this passenger and not this passenger. And, for people in this room, that matters a lot. But it also, like I said, it shines a light on what's happening on board. It illuminates part of the greater story, and that's really the whole point, is to bring a fresh take to this. The Chinese edition, I wrote it specifically to be simple so that all, street names in Liverpool wouldn't have to be translated, because then it just makes the whole story clunky and whatever. Now, what I'm doing now is, before I send it to the publisher in June, is kind of adding back a lot of that detail that for native readers will be both relevant, but also it won't be as difficult to deal with. And the publisher has asked that we put in more about the process. I kept myself kind of out of the first draft, and he said, yes, but where are you in this? And I said, I think my name goes on the front, and that's about enough. And they didn't like that answer, so I had to kind of include a bit more about the process and the team and so forth. But yeah, it's different ways to tell the same story, and each reveals a little bit. One thing that's changed is that we've lost quite a few people that we met during the filming of the documentary. There are 3 or 4 characters who have passed away since we started, either because of COVID or just the passage of time. So, when you lose resources like that, suddenly you can't go back and check something. You hope that your notes are complete. So it's and it's a reminder that things do change over time, and that you do lose witnesses and you do lose storytellers. So it's tricky sometimes.
Yeah, it's the importance of oral history is so important. I was recently researching the history a little bit of the Titanic Historical Society and kind of going back through that origin story. And it's so crucial. Without them, we wouldn't have the testimonies from the survivors who were still alive at the time. And of course, I think those form that, with Walter Lord, form the complete canon for Titanic historiography. And it's so true, and that's where I started. I actually, running oral history projects is where I started way back when I was an undergrad, and I didn't know what I was doing, and it's a sharp learning curve actually conducting them. It's a skill set. I'm babbling a little. I'm sitting here just so interested. I don't even know where to go, but I have more questions, but also I don't know if anyone I would love to give a chance to all of you to ask questions too. Does anybody have question that they'd like to throw to the panel? No pressure, but if you do.
We have a question from online.
Oh, that's great. Let's go for it.
Let's see. From a professional opinion, if the Titanic will be completely gone in 50 years, I see many articles from various sites, not all accurate, saying we have a decade or 2 at most to still have physical evidence on the bottom of the ocean. I think she's saying, do you agree with that?
I think several of us will have an opinion on this, so I'll keep it brief, but I think it's a misnomer that the ship will be gone in 50 years. The superstructure and the more lightweight, non-structural bearing parts of the ship are disintegrating. You can see that clearly from the last 20 or 30 years. and particularly since you go back to the first expeditions in the 80s. But the hull of the ship is still largely what it looked like when it was first discovered, like the actual hull part of it. Yes, there'll be degradation. There's certain things, like it's a hot button topic about salvage and whether you agree with that or not, and I can't tell anyone in this room how to feel about it, and I don't particularly want to go into that myself, but I do think that one of the arguments is, like, there's some items like the Marconi wireless set that could be retrieved if there was permission given for that, which could collapse down into the wreck and then be pretty much where it can't be retrieved. So there's certainly things that can be preserved or found now that as it degrades are going to be harder, but the wreck, I don't believe the wreck is going to be fully gone in 50 years. I think it's been talked about a lot, but I don't think it's accurate.
Yeah, I agree with that assessment a lot. Definitely the superstructure, the more lightweight built stuff up on the top of the ship, you may have some degradation, but the main part of the ship has really stayed relatively stable since it was discovered in 85 and explored in 86. There was a big kerfuffle online, I think it was late last year, when some images were released from the Magellan scan publicly that showed a bulge on the port side of the hull, and this wave went around the internet of people saying, oh my goodness, look, this means that the whole port side hull is falling down into the seabed and we really have to get it in. That wasn't what happened, because if the whole port side of the hull was sliding down, you would have a big gap opening up at the top. So I really do believe that the wreck, the main portion of the wreck, will stay there for a long time, but it is going to get worse over time. So it's important to explore. It's important to document what's there, to get into areas that haven't been documented before. There's a question about salvage of the Marconi equipment, if that could be done without damaging the wreck. That's an interesting idea. But there's also strong feelings that have to be taken into account about salvage and things like that. So we always try to respect everyone's viewpoint on that perspective too.
And when you're talking about the Marconi room, this is kind of my opinion as opposed to Ted and Ken's. If they're going to do it, and I realize there's arguments on both sides, they can't wait 50 years. It won't be there. They're going to have to decide sooner rather than later. Now, what is sooner? I don't know. But I guarantee it won't be there in 50 years. That whole, the superstructure is collapsing down inside the ship. And that will continue. And right now, we've got an expedition going down roughly every year. And every year they go down and, oh, that's changed. That's going to continue. That's going to continue. They may get actually, let's say they decide they want to go down and get the Marconi room equipment next year. They get down and I'm like, oh, too late. That could happen. We don't know. I'm just saying it's going to have, if it's going to be done, they got to, I can't use the term my father used to use. They need to do it soon.
They need to make the decision soon.
My father was in the Navy during World War II. He was a radio man. He knew Morse. When we were living on the Washington coast, we lived next door to the radio station. We would get bleed of Morse from the radio station into our kitchen radio. And one day I asked my dad, do you know what's that saying? He says, I'm a little rusty. I said, what's it saying? He listened and he started telling me what it said. He said, it's a weather report. But it was cool. I mean, at that point, I knew about something about Titanic. And I thought Morse was cool. And he could do it. They don't do Morse anymore. Oh well.
Can you tell us about the fire reported on Titanic?
It's not just questions, these are all the questions.
They are
They're
the
coming
questions.
in.
Very hot topic questions. This is something that's been known since 1912. It made its way into the inquiries. It's not a headline, but a few years ago there was a program that aired on television that blew these claims about how the fire affected the maiden voyage completely out of control and completely out of touch with reality, unfortunately. And it made it seem as if the striking of the iceberg was a result of the coal fire and that the ship sank more quickly because of the coal fire. Well, one of the first things that we said when we saw that was, that's nonsense. because we've done all the research on this for so long, but we needed to, you can't just say that, you need to prove it. You need to come out, you gotta have your references, you gotta, so we did the legwork. First we did an online article, and then we incorporated those findings into a book later on. And really the coal fire, it was not something that was completely unusual on ships at that time. And the location of the coal fire, one of the things we kind of chuckled over as we were doing our homework, is that the fire was right underneath the first class swimming bath. And now we have an account from Archibald Gracie, Colonel Gracie, who said that he went swimming in the swimming bath on Sunday morning, the morning of the disaster, and you realize that if the fire was as bad as they were saying it was, Gracie would basically have been a lobster in a boiling hot swimming pool.
I've never heard that before. That's amazing.
Yeah, he said it was heated to a refreshing degree, and boy, it's not refreshing to me.
Yeah. There were claims about a smudge that appeared on the outside of the hull. Well, we did our homework, and one of the things we found is that the way the hull of the Olympic-class liner was shaped, there tended to be a reflection in that area, in that curve of the hull plating, if the light caught it just right. So you look at this smudge in this one photograph, and you say, oh my goodness, this...
Two photographs.
From almost the same angle, and you say, oh my goodness, it's evidence that the hull is boiling hot. And it's not, because then you look at other photographs from different angles, and the smudge isn't there. But then you look at photographs of Olympic, where the light catches that same spot just right, and you see that smudge. She didn't have a coal fire, and that was, many of those photos were after she was converted to oil burning too. So it had nothing to do with the coal bunker fire. We do know that the fire was put out on Saturday, 112 years ago today. We know that it was cool enough for the crewmen to go in to the bunker. Which one was it that was asked to run the oil on the Dillon? Was it Dillon or Barrett? It might have been Barrett. It was Barrett or Dillon were told to go in, and they were actually it was cool enough they could put the oil right over the unprotected hull, the steel, so that it didn't corrode. So the fire was out, it was extinguished, it had nothing to do with running the ship at top speed to burn off extra coal or anything like that. One interesting thing is, though, is that from emptying that starboard side bunker, it produced a slight list to port for the ship. But what did we find, about 2 degrees?
Around about.
And there's some question about whether the fact that bunker was empty, it might actually have helped the situation. There's been some theories about that. It's not something that, I've done a lot of homework on, but it's an interesting theory, that in fact the fire may have helped things instead of hurting things. So hopefully that answers that.
I'll add one part to that. I need both my hands. When you look at these two pictures of the smudge is here. The fire is here, 53 feet apart. They can't be the same thing. It's physically impossible.
In fact, we found a photo that was taken on one of the tenders at Queenstown. It's the famous photo looking up at Captain Smith, looking through the bridge wing. And when we started looking at it, we're like, they're right next to where the fire was. Certainly they wouldn't have been looking up at Captain Smith and taking a nice happy picture if the hull was high and was searing hot and the hull plating was basically melting. So it's an interesting question. It's a popular subject, but unfortunately it's been blown way out of proportion over the years.
I told Stephen this yesterday, this example. This is not a Titanic example, but I think it's very related. Mythologies, metaphorical or real ghost stories, whatever they may be, things that circulate online, are often easily debunked when you actually take a moment to listen to experts. My family and I were at one of the plantations in Louisiana doing a tour a couple of weeks ago, and they didn't have any interpretation of slavery or slave cabins, so I was running around hot-headed and mad, and it was quite an experience. But they have these ghost stories that they tell there. And when we got home, this new documentary popped up on Netflix, and the whole episode about the Myrtles, which is where we had been, was just that historians had gone into the archives and within a few minutes, in some cases, just completely debunked every ghost story that they tell. No, this person didn't die this year. They died 3 years later of yellow fever. And it got me thinking that so many of the Titanic conspiracies, they circulate online because people just press share or press click and type. But look how easy it is to debunk these ridiculous theories If you have experts,
It's not that easy.
No,
Sometimes we have to work it.
what I mean is, for us, it's easy if we have access to experts, and it's the experts who have done the hard work of being in the archives like you all have. If we listen to the experts, then it's pretty easy to lay these conspiracies to bed. So that we're filming this, let's get this to go viral online, so then people will stop, circulating these nonsense conspiracy theories. Was there one more?
There is one more. What advice would you give a young person who wants to go into the field of Titanic experts or Titanic researchers?
I love that question. We were just talking before with some of the staff here about the importance of moving this on to the next generation of individuals for history, because if you look at the historical societies, the age and demographics of individuals that are doing the research, it skews very heavily older overall. And sadly, we're not all going to be here 50, 60 years from now. So we need a new generation to come in to pick this up and continue to tell these stories, because there is no living witnesses to this anymore. It's not living history now. It's the voices of those individuals, their stories, what happened to them. It's the current generation's job to preserve that and make sure people don't forget what happened and the lessons of that, and that these were real people that were affected in very real ways. So I think that for a young person, what I would recommend if they're interested is, first of all, start by getting some of the books that are considered reputable. I mean, Night to Remember, there's a lot of things that are outdated because it's from the 1950s, but
Yeah, it's from
that's
the
a great
It's a
starting point.
great book,
Yes.
but it's 70 years old.
Yeah.
It's outdated. I've read it 5 or 6 times. It's really good. And also, when I was working on the creating the Titanic Inquiry website and was transcribing a lot of stuff, I saw right where Walter Lord got his information. He nailed it. But his information is 70 years old.
Yeah, so read everything you can. That'd be my advice. Read everything you can. Mark down what you didn't get an answer to. What questions did you have when you read these books that aren't answered by any of the researchers or authors? And then start doing some digging. There's a lot of things that we didn't have when we started this process. We had to go look through the old school microfilm, reel to reel, the little slides, and you're getting seasick because it's going past the screen. Now it's all available through digital newspaper archives, and you can run keyword searches and all these things. So start digging into the questions about what people said or what they did, and then don't take for granted what we write in the book. Dig into it yourself and try to make your own conclusions based on that. So just read everything you can and then try to expand on it. That's what I would recommend.
I would just add, I mean, it's technology that's going to take us forward. You need to do the homework, especially the homework that these gentlemen have done, and read and crunch and try to make your own, come to your own conclusions. But certainly in terms of the wreck going forward, it's going to be all about scanning. It's going to be all about using new technological tools. And the same thing is going to be true with information. Imagine if you could, you use the Titanic Inquiry website, which is just such an incredible tool, but imagine if you could dump that and then all of their books and Walter Lord's books, and imagine if you could dump all of that into some kind of central database that you could then search using AI, saying, okay, give me the complete biography of person X, or give me a route. And then also you have tools like our friend Tom Linsky and some of the virtual reality work that's been done of Titanic. I mean, it makes such a difference to be able, it's one thing to look at a set of blueprints, it's another thing to be able to walk through the wreck and really see, oh wait, that watertight door is closed. I can only go up the stairs, So being able to create and then utilize those new tools, that's really what's going to start to take us forward, because that really takes us closer to being able to recreate what it was like to be in that spot at that moment. And then you can start to use all the information that's available and bring that together.
I was just going to add to that. We love the young ones that are up and coming, because we were once the young ones ourselves who were wide-eyed watching, Raise the Titanic or SOS Titanic, and it just became such a, the hobby turns into a passion, it turns into the serious work. So anyone who's young, who's interested in the subject, Titanic is a very deep well, and there are still untold stories passengers that we know very little about, crew members that we know very little about, and there has to be more information out there. They're still finding Titanic photographs every now and then, and you know, you'd think that's because it's such a popular subject, it would all be found, and yet every now and then a new one crops up, something that no one's seen before. So be willing to do the homework, be willing to put the hard work in, to go to primary reference material, find what people who were actually there said, and then piece it into the whole as a narrative, and that will help. Take the time to do that, and you'll eventually, if it takes root and this is what you enjoy doing, you'll be sitting here one day answering questions from the other young ones.
You know, my advice would be go to the primary sources as much as you can and go find those. Like you guys have all said, don't just echo what's already been put together. Go back to the primary sources. For example, I was researching Harold Blow, and just for a bonus episode on my Patreon, and as I'm going back through his testimony, you have to read it and see the back and forth to get a sense of their personality, their humor, and you don't just trust somebody to tell you what Harold Blow is like. Go read the testimony, because his personality is on the page, and you can learn so much about him. We talked about him a little bit in the live show this afternoon. You know, just, yeah, it's the inquiry is a perfect example. Go read that, take the time. And we live in a world, in a society, you know, it's cliche to say, but it's so true, that, you know, we don't think about stopping and reading a 500-page, you know, set inquiry, but
1,200 pages of each.
1,200. But don't do that, you know, like, just sit down with that or print it out from the website and just read it, because I think it's way more enjoyable than you ever would think it would be. If you're obsessed with Titanic, you'll just discover these beautiful little nuggets that you wouldn't if you only relied on the secondary text.
I will point out that on the inquiry website, there's a page where you can download either a PDF or a Word document of the whole thing. It makes it real easy to do research. I've downloaded the Word document and I use it all the time. I find it easier to navigate than the website. I will also correct one thing I said earlier. I said that I helped create the inquiry website. Main man was Rob Oppers, who was a friend of mine. He still keeps it up. The occasional time we find an error, we fix it. So I will also say one other thing. As good as Walter Lord's A Night to Remember book is, it's not a primary source. It's secondary. The inquiries are primary.
That's a crucial thing to mention. I actually, you know, quite often will find myself in conversation and A Night to Remember is mentioned as a primary source, and it's not. You know, and I've gotten in trouble, and I've angered people when I've said that before, but because I'm not knocking the book, it's a beautiful, beautiful book, but you're right, it's not a primary source. I think in the Titanic world, some people do think it is. So it's just important to like have these checks as you're, you know, learning how to research and write about
Our
it.
book is not a primary source either.
Perfect, yeah, exactly.
That's why we put the endnotes in there, so that you can go back to their primary sources, because most of these are available online now. And I would also add, you know, Facebook and other social media groups, it's interesting to see how things are changing as we move deep into the 21st century with how people get their information. Facebook connects people, all of these different groups, they connect people, but you can't always put your trust in just anybody that's on one of these groups that thinks they know a thing or two about Titanic. You have to go back to the original source material. Don't just take, I read it in a social media post. That's not a primary source document. Also, there's a tendency on the part of some researchers to only focus on inquiry testimony. You have to look beyond the inquiry testimony. Sometimes the questioning was so narrow because they had a point, they had a purpose, and time was money. You know, they wanted to wrap the inquiry up. So if a witness started expanding on something too much, you know, you could see that the lawyers, Lord Mercy, or whoever was in charge, they would say, well, you know, let's move on. And sometimes it's just when you're getting to, when you know they're about to say something that you're looking for, and it's like, let's move along. You know, short attention span back in 1912 leads to problems for us researching today. But sometimes those very same survivors will give in letters, sometimes published in newspapers, or through direct interviews with reporters, their version of the story told in an unhurried way, where they weren't necessarily nervous, they weren't being questioned on a witness stand, having to defend, their eyesight for the lookouts, questions of binoculars, how that, you can see how the perspective shapes the testimony, but now they're opening up and they're giving their story the way they want to tell it. And so it's important to use good newspaper accounts, good letters, good other things, and compare that with what you find in the inquiries where people spoke under oath, which we know there were lies that were told during the inquiries too. We know, for example, that Lights Roller was in the prime area to have seen the ship break up. We know, based on an account from another survivor, that in the moment he actually said, it looks like the stern will float, swim for the stern. We know he saw the ship break, and yet when he went to the inquiries, the ship never broke. So you can't always just trust the inquiries either. You have to balance all of the different perspectives, all the different material, and that takes time. But it is also so rewarding and so fulfilling when you have that light bulb moment, and it makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up.
I have something connected to what Kent was just saying. Years ago, I wrote an article called "The Facts: What Did People Really See of the Titanic Breaking Up?" I just looked purely at the inquiry testimony, and when I was going, especially going through the British inquiry, there were a lot of times they were questioning the survivors, and they said, "Did you see the Titanic go down?" And then the people asking the questions changed the subject. It almost feels like they're saying, "Did you see the Titanic go down?" "Yes, I did." "Okay, let's ask you about something else now." It was so obvious that they were trying to avoid letting people say it broke up. When I counted up the numbers, there were 4 people, I'm remembering here, 4 people who said the ship sank intact. There were 21 people who said it broke apart. Who are you going to listen to? But because the people running the inquiries wrote the final report, they chose to believe the 4. And that's what we've all believed ever since. I'm old enough to remember before the Titanic was found. I believed it sank intact. And then Valerie found it broke apart, and I guess I was wrong. And so was everybody else.
Are there any questions? Yeah, great.
My question is, if with all the research that you've done and different things that you've all looked into, are there still one or more pressing mysteries or questions that you want answered, that it just gnaws at you, or you still, when you're looking at something, you're like, oh, this might be the moment that I find this little side thing out that I've been thinking about all these years? Is there still that one thing that you don't know the answer to that you want to have closure on?
What haunts you in the middle of it?
Yeah.
Okay.
The deep
Okay, that's yours.
No, certainly there were a lot of accounts about gunfire, particularly late in the sinking. We had accounts of around collapsible sea, for example, early in that loading process, that there were shots fired, that there was, kind of a push on that boat. And then it's kind of gotten lost in the pages of history a bit. We know, for example, that there were shots fired very close to the end. But what's gnawingly frustrating for us is we can't always put a face or a name to who was pulling the trigger or who was standing in the way of those bullets, if anyone. We have found a number of corroborating accounts just within the past, I think, 5-10 years.
Fairly recently.
Where there was a passenger who was shot in the jaw in a very late shooting. And if you just caught it from, a whiff of it from one account, you could just easily say, it's a reporter making something up. But then you pick up the scent from another eyewitness, and you get it from another, and you get it from another. And even though it's not a perfect match, there's enough puzzle pieces there to go, these people all saw the same thing. But there isn't enough information to actually draw the line and say exactly what happened. And so that's one of the things that I think for us, it does bother us. We're always on the lookout for some new tidbit that will help refine that.
And just to clarify, the piece about somebody being shot in the jaw, we were finding accounts. Our good friend and researcher George Behe, who, if you ever want to read fantastic Titanic books, and he has so many, I don't even know the count now.
15 to 20.
15 to 20.
And that doesn't count his unpublished
Yeah, a
books.
lot of unpublished ones. He did a whole study of all these witnesses that claim that exact same story, separately, different cities, different newspapers, that where there's less likely to be contamination amongst witnesses, and it seems to be something to that. And I would say, like, a lot of people gave James Cameron flack because he portrayed that in the movie. You can make a real historical case that happens. It's just that the identity is not as hard. If it did happen, you can't really nail it down to one person, which is where the controversy comes from. But there's some credible reasons. You have one passenger, Eugene Daly, who was a third-class passenger, who mentioned this in a letter to his sister about this allegedly happening. He mentioned it in press accounts, and there was the limitation of liability hearings, which were held after the disaster, where survivors were seeking financial compensation from the White Star Line, and they were seeking to limit their liability. And Eugene Daly in 1915 in New York District Court, if you believe the newspaper summaries, and this is years after the sinking, they mentioned that he described in port seeing people shot. So it's not something that was some wild newspaper story that was invented in the yellow press by reporters, which certainly happened back in those days, but there's real credible witnesses claiming this for over and over again. But there's a lot of details are murky, and it's like, that's where you get controversy, because you have real people, real families, and you're putting a name to it when we can't 100% prove that. I think that's why that was a controversial decision.
I think Cameron basically has said in multiple interviews now, he doesn't regret the storylines, he just regrets using a real figure like Murdoch, for example, with the suicide scene. But in terms of the other gunshot that's in the film, with, I think it's Tommy and Fabrizio, and then,
Tommy is the one that gets shot.
Yeah, I've always thought that there's no problem with that scene being in the film, just based on what you guys have researched way beyond anything I've ever read about it. But I think the controversy has really been about Murdoch, right, and using the real historical figure and a gun when we don't have any, we really don't know.
And that's further money because the officer ship in Southampton before the maiden voyage, we know that Wilde came in at the last minute and that Murdoch and Lightoller were reduced in rank one step each, but we also have a photo in Queenstown that showed that they hadn't changed the number of stripes on their sleeves.
So they were misidentified.
So
yeah.
You have a lot of people who say the chief officer. Well, the question is, do they know the chief officer by name? Had they sailed with him before, or are they going by the number of stripes on the sleeve? You look at the staff that works here, our wonderful hosts, you look at their sleeves, their insignia, it means something. 4 stripes on the sleeve for captain, 3 for chief officer, but then you had 2 chief officer uniforms who were on the ships with 3 stripes. And so which chief officer is being discussed? Why, for example, did Lightoller and the other surviving officers who actually were nowhere near where Lightoller was, why did they feel the need to write to Murdoch's widow to say that he hadn't killed himself and that they saw him working at the end? Is it because they thought maybe there was a kernel of truth in those rumors and something had happened? Or was it someone else? Was it a question of stripe, a misidentification? And so this is where it becomes very difficult to research, and feelings can get hurt. We know that the people in Murdoch's hometown, after the movie came out, their feelings were hurt, and Murdoch there's no doubt he was a hero. He saved so many people during that night. But you always have to feel that responsibility when you're doing this research, that you're not saying something off the cuff. Everything is evidence-based, and that you aren't going beyond the evidence that you have available.
In our book on A Sea of Glass, we've got an appendix that goes into, what was it exactly? Were we aiming directly at Murdoch? No. Did an officer shoot himself on the Titanic? There's a very long appendix where we looked at it from every which way we could think of.
Just 2 general things. I mean, obviously with 6, we weren't able to get a complete story for every single one of those survivors. So obviously that bothers me, and who knows, maybe somebody will call me. Somebody will call me and tell me, oh, by the way, my grandfather. But I'm always curious about the iceberg itself. It's like the lost murder weapon. I'd really like to see, because to me it's a physics question. you have a number of accounts, you have a number of people who said, okay, it was this tall, or it was this, or whatever. You have icebergs that were sighted, you know, when day broke. You have photographs of, you know, ships that went through the area afterwards saying, oh, there was a red stain on this, or this was this, and, you know, I just think it's a physics problem that you know, somebody could work up, and it'd be a lot of fun to kind of look at that. Because I mean, really, it's, you know, the iceberg causes it, and then suddenly it's out of sight and it's gone. It's like almost gone from the entire story, you know. And it's like, oh yeah, well, you know, it's the lost murder weapon. And then Ellie and I were talking about this earlier. I'm not saying that they necessarily exist, but it bothers me that there are no known photographs taken during the sinking, and that if you even suggest that on a Titanic board, you get shouted down like a lunatic. Maybe that part bothers me more than the exhibit. But you know, we have photos of Titanic taken by, you know, a parish priest. So it's not like photographic technology was unavailable. There were certainly people on board who could afford cameras, and we have passengers on Carpathia who get their, you know, camera out and start snapping away as soon as the lifeboat. So it's not like the technology was you know, just beyond any passenger. I understand there are lighting issues and so forth, but it just seems like, especially if they're going up on deck and they're not really taking it seriously and whatever, you know, somebody might have just slung a camera around their neck or stuck it in their pocket, or, you know, I always feel like someday we're going to see, you know, a very blurry, you know, unclear photo when you can kind of make out a stack in the background, and that's just always surprised me a little bit. So.
Someone's attic. You know, as we're you know, running over and transition into a signing, and but I agreed with his thought, and I've often thought about this. And there is, if anybody knows more about it, to you guys, Marvin's, and you know, yeah, there is. I have read in a few places there is the lore that a canister of film was tossed down to her in the lifeboat, and that it never surfaced. But you know, Stephen knows this because I've told him 87 times since he's known me. I'm a broken record. You know, I firmly believe that, you know, there are still bits of Titanic history to be found in people's attics and trunks and deep drawers, and I think there are probably a lot of descendants that are sitting on things they may not even realize. And yeah, I think that that's the exciting thing about it. I think there's potential for things to still pop up. Letters, diaries, articles of clothing, whatever it may be. And that's the type of thing that keeps all of this exciting. Well, I think maybe we should, what do you think, Emily? Should we, I know we're running a little over, should we wrap up? Thank you guys so much. This has been just a delight. I feel like I have the best job ever to just sit here and get to, you know, facilitate this. Obviously, encourage everybody to get a copy of On a Sea of Glass. If you don't, Stephen, tell them about the 6th is coming out. Well, it's out in Chinese. It's coming out in English next year.
Right.
You
It's
also
out in
have
Chinese.
another book that people can hop on Amazon and find. It's not about Titanic, but it's related.
Kind of cut my teeth on finding a lost submarine off the Chinese coast about 10 years ago. It's almost 15 years ago now, but that's available. Yeah, it's a good story. It has a lot of twists. It's if you like maritime history, and there's also an accompanying documentary. That's how Arthur Jones, our director, and I got started, and we had so much fun that we had to go out and do another one, and then we almost had a fist fight over Titanic. So it just kind of goes that way, and I'm sure these 3 gentlemen are very familiar with that process. So.
And tell them the title.
It's called Poseidon. There's a very long subtitle.
If you search Poseidon in your
Poseidon, my last name, you'll find it easily. So, or Poseidon in China, you'll find it easily.
Yeah, thank you guys. This has been great. And stick around if people, I think the little mingling, and stick around if anybody has a book to sign and that sort of thing. So, thank you all for coming. We really appreciate it.